Look at the smartphone in your hands right now. The fluid way you swipe to close an application. The way your contacts instantly sync across the cloud. You are using technology, pioneered by a corporate ghost. In 2005, Palm was the undisputed dictator of the American mobile market. They did not just build devices, they invented the entire concept of the personal digital assistant. They were generating billions in revenue, and their iconic communicators were clipped to the belt of every powerful executive in the country. They held the future in the palm of their hands. Then it all evaporated. The production line stopped. The brilliant engineers scattered. The brand was brutally erased from the market. How does an empire that laid the exact blueprint for the modern digital age suffer such a total, devastating collapse? This is the story of Palm. Chapter 1. The Dawn of the Personal Digital Era. The early 1990s presented a technological landscape defined by physical bulk. Desktop computers dominated office spaces with heavy cathode ray tube monitors and massive towers. Mobile communication meant carrying cellular phones the size of construction bricks. The idea of holding a genuine computing device in the palm of a hand seemed relegated to science fiction movies. Yet, Jeff Hawkins, a neuroscientist turned engineer, possessed a different vision. He obsessed over the human brain and its capacity for pattern recognition. He believed technology should adapt to human behavior, not the other way around. In 1992, Hawkins founded Palm Computing. He quickly recruited Donna Dubinsky, a former Apple logistics and sales executive known for her fierce determination, and Ed Colligan, a brilliant product marketer. Together, they formed a formidable leadership triad. Their initial mission was clear, but incredibly difficult. They wanted to build a small, intuitive piece of software for handheld devices. The market, however, proved brutally unforgiving. Massive tech conglomerates were already failing in this space. Apple Computer heavily promoted the Newton Message Pad in 1993. It was a highly anticipated device that promised revolutionary handwriting recognition. Instead, it delivered comedy. The Newton failed to understand basic words, turning user input into nonsensical text and becoming a running joke in mainstream media. Meanwhile, Palm partnered with Casio and Tandy to release the Zoomer. It was a catastrophic failure. The Zoomer was sluggish, confusing, and lacked a compelling reason to exist. Consumers ignored it. Palm Computing burned through its venture capital and stared directly at bankruptcy. The Zoomer disaster forced a painful but necessary reckoning. Hawkins, Dubinsky, and Colligan analyzed the wreckage of their own product and Apple's Newton. They discovered a profound market truth. People did not want a desktop computer crammed into a small plastic box. They simply wanted a digital replacement for their paper planners and address books. Hawkins took this revelation to a literal extreme. He retreated to his garage and cut a block of wood to the exact dimensions of his shirt pocket. For months, he carried this wooden block everywhere. He pulled it out during meetings to simulate checking a calendar. He tapped on it to mimic taking notes. He used it to determine the exact physical limits of a truly portable device. This physical constraint birthed a radical design philosophy. A successful device had to fit in a pocket, it had to wake up instantly, and it required a flawless input method. Hawkins knew traditional handwriting recognition was a dead end. The processing power required was too high, and the error rate frustrated users. He flipped the problem upside down. Instead of forcing the machine to learn human handwriting, he decided to teach humans a new, simplified alphabet. He engineered graffiti. Graffiti required users to write single-stroke characters in a dedicated area on the screen. It demanded a slight learning curve. However, once a user spent 30 minutes learning the strokes, the system offered near-perfect accuracy and rapid input speed. It was an engineering triumph that solved the primary bottleneck of mobile computing. Equipped with a clear vision and the graffiti software, Palm needed to build their own hardware. Lacking funds, they sold the company to modem manufacturer US Robotics in 1995. This provided the necessary capital to manufacture the device Hawkins had simulated with his block of wood. In 1996, the Palm Pilot 1000 and 5000 hit the market. Palm aggressively marketed them as connected organizers, deliberately avoiding the word computer. The design was a masterclass in minimalist utility. It featured a crisp monochrome screen, a dedicated graffiti writing area, and a sleek gray casing. More importantly, it included a simple plastic docking cradle with a single button. This was the hot sync technology. A user simply placed the Palm Pilot in the cradle, pressed the button, and the device instantly synchronized its calendar, contacts, and notes with a desktop PC. It seamlessly bridged the gap between mobile and stationary work environments. The consumer response defied all expectations. The Palm Pilot did not just sell well, it ignited a cultural revolution across the corporate landscape. By the late 1990s, the Palm Pilot had completely transcended its status as a mere electronic gadget. It became the ultimate symbol of professional efficiency and status in the United States. Demand exploded. Customers formed massive lines outside retail stores, clearing shelves faster than factories could supply them. On Wall Street, investment bankers furiously tapped on their screens while riding the subway. In Silicon Valley, tech executives coordinated multi-million-dollar deals using the stylus. The sharp, rhythmic tapping sound of a plastic stylus hitting a glass screen became the background noise of modern American business. Having a Palm Pilot clipped to a belt or tucked into a tailored suit pocket broadcasted a clear message. It meant the user was connected, organized, and moving relentlessly toward the future. Palm sold over 1 million units in an astonishingly short period, shattering previous records for technology adoption. They completely annihilated the barrier between human intent and digital execution. At this moment, Palm Computing achieved absolute market supremacy. They created the personal digital assistant category from nothing and conquered it entirely. They stood at the very pinnacle of the consumer electronics world. They had changed how humanity interacted with data, but standing at the absolute peak offers only one direction to look, and the ground below was beginning to shift. Chapter 2: Peak Power and the Palm Treo Icon. The turn of the millennium brought a new challenge to the mobile computing landscape. The Palm Pilot had successfully conquered the organizer market, but users now faced a frustrating physical burden. Corporate professionals carried a Palm device for their schedule, a cellular phone for voice calls, and a two-way pager for urgent text messages. Pockets grew heavy. Briefcases became cluttered with tangled charging cables. The obvious evolutionary step required combining these disparate machines into a single, unified unit. However, the path to this convergence proved chaotic for the company that started the mobile revolution. Internal friction tore Palm apart just as they reached their initial peak of influence. The corporate parent company, 3Com, failed to understand the nimble, rapid nature of the mobile device market. Frustrated by endless bureaucratic delays and a lack of creative control over their own invention, founders Jeff Hawkins and Donna Dubinsky made a drastic decision in 1998. They resigned. They walked away from the empire they built and immediately founded a new startup named Handspring. They took their core engineering philosophy with them. Handspring licensed the Palm operating system and began building hardware that directly competed with their former employer. They released the Visor, a device that featured a revolutionary expansion slot on the back. Users could plug in physical modules to turn the standard organizer into a digital camera, an MP3 player, or, most importantly, a cellular phone. This modular approach served as a vital bridge to the ultimate goal. Hawkins understood that snapping a phone module onto an organizer was merely a temporary, clunky fix. The market demanded true integration from the ground up. In 2002, Handspring delivered the answer. They released the Treo line of communicators. The earliest models featured a familiar digital screen, but added a built-in keyboard or a flip cover with an integrated speaker. The industry recognized it immediately as a revelation. For the first time, a user could check their digital calendar while actively speaking on a voice call without juggling two different pieces of hardware. The integration of email, contacts, and voice communication inside one sleek plastic shell fundamentally altered the trajectory of consumer electronics. Meanwhile, the original Palm company struggled to innovate without its visionary founders guiding the ship. They engaged in a bizarre corporate dance. They spun off their software division into a separate entity called Palm Source, while the hardware division rebranded itself as Palm One. They created confusing product lines and rapidly lost market momentum. The hardware division, struggling to build a compelling smartphone of its own, realized they desperately needed the very people they had alienated years prior. In 2003, Palm One made the only logical move available to secure their survival. They acquired Handspring. This massive deal brought Hawkins and Dubinsky back into the fold and secured total ownership of the Treo brand. The reunion set the stage for the company's absolute zenith. The release of the Treo 600, and later, the wildly successful Treo 650 cemented Palm as the undisputed king of the nascent American smartphone market. The physical design became instantly iconic. It featured a bright color screen, a tightly packed but highly usable QWERTY keyboard arranged in a distinctive smile shape, and a stubby external antenna. It ran on the Palm OS, an interface which millions of users already knew and trusted deeply. It was not just a communication tool. It operated as a mobile command center. Business executives could review complex spreadsheets in airport departure lounges. Real estate agents could update client databases directly from their cars. The device seamlessly synchronized with enterprise email servers, making it an absolutely essential corporate asset. The sharp click of the plastic keys became the defining soundtrack of modern productivity. The Treo quickly transcended the sterile business world and infiltrated mainstream popular culture. Hollywood celebrities were routinely photographed holding them on red carpets and in coffee shops. Politicians utilized them on the campaign trail to manage grueling, minute-by-minute schedules. The device appeared constantly in prime-time television shows and blockbuster movies. It acted as visual shorthand for wealth, power, and extreme importance. Palm controlled a massive, commanding share of the smartphone market. They achieved record-breaking revenues. They had successfully navigated the incredibly dangerous transition from building simple personal organizers to manufacturing complex cellular communicators. By 2005, possessing a Palm Treo meant you were operating at the absolute highest level of modern society. However, the view from the top of the mountain often obscures the storm clouds gathering directly on the horizon. The very financial success of the Treo bred a dangerous corporate complacency. Palm leadership looked at their massive quarterly sales figures and falsely concluded they had permanently solved the mobile computing equation. They believed their hardware, keyboard, and their aging operating system represented the final, perfect form factor of the smartphone. Underneath the glossy surface of record profits, the foundational technology was rotting away. The Palm OS, originally engineered in the mid-1990s for simple disconnected organizers, struggled violently to handle the heavy demands of a high-speed wireless world. It utilized a single tasking architecture. If a user was browsing the web and a phone call came in, the operating system had to aggressively suspend the browser to answer the call. It lacked modern memory management. It crashed frequently when overloaded with multimedia applications or large email attachments. Independent software developers found it increasingly difficult and frustrating to build modern applications on such an antiquated framework. Palm engineers repeatedly warned executive management about the decaying software architecture. They pleaded for resources to build a completely new operating system from scratch. Management refused the request. Rebuilding the core software required massive capital investment and years of unglamorous development. It meant potentially halting the highly profitable Treo production line to retool their entire ecosystem. The leadership chose the comfortable, familiar path. They applied minor, cosmetic updates to the old code, desperately hoping to stretch the lifespan of the Palm OS for a few more years. They prioritized immediate quarterly earnings and stock prices over long-term technological survival. This fatal hubris dictated their entire market strategy. They assumed their loyal, deeply entrenched customer base would never abandon the familiar Treo interface. They dismissed early warning signs from aggressive competitors. Research in Motion was gaining massive ground with their BlackBerry devices, effectively cornering the global enterprise email market with superior security protocols. Microsoft was pushing Windows Mobile into cheap, adaptable hardware built by agile Asian manufacturers. Yet, Palm leadership remained firmly convinced of their own invulnerability. They rested entirely on their past achievements, completely unaware that the fundamental rules of the mobile industry were about to change permanently. They sat comfortably in their Silicon Valley headquarters, entirely unprepared for the technological earthquake that was quietly brewing just a few miles down the highway in Cupertino. Chapter 3: The Earthquake from Cupertino. As the year 2007 began, the executives at Palm held every reason to feel invincible. They had successfully navigated the brutal transition from digital organizers to cellular communicators. The Treo line generated massive revenue. They had even swallowed their pride and released a version of the Treo running Microsoft Windows Mobile to capture a broader corporate audience. They possessed a loyal customer base, deep relationships with wireless carriers, and a brand name synonymous with mobile productivity. In their minds, they had built a fortress. They completely failed to realize that the ground beneath their fortress was built on a fault line. That fault line ruptured violently on the 9th of January, 2007. The epicenter was the Moscone Center in San Francisco. Steve Jobs walked onto the Macworld stage wearing his signature black turtleneck and blue jeans. He stood before a packed audience of journalists, developers, and technology enthusiasts. He promised to introduce 3 revolutionary products. He listed a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. He repeated the list until the audience realized he was not talking about 3 separate machines. He was talking about a single device. He called it the iPhone. In a presentation that lasted just over an hour, Apple completely dismantled the mobile computing paradigm that Palm had spent a decade building. Jobs directly attacked the current landscape of smartphones. He projected an image of a Palm Treo alongside a BlackBerry and a Motorola Q on the massive screen behind him. He pointed out their fatal flaw. They all featured static, unchangeable plastic keyboards that occupied half the physical device. Apple proposed a radical alternative. They removed the physical keyboard entirely. They replaced it with a massive, continuous sheet of glass. They discarded the stylus, a tool Palm had convinced the world was strictly necessary for mobile input. Jobs famously mocked the concept of a stylus, noting that humans were already born with 10 pointing devices. The iPhone utilized a revolutionary multi-touch interface. Users manipulated digital content directly with their bare fingers. They could pinch to zoom on photographs. They could scroll through long lists with a simple flick of a thumb. The hardware was only half the earthquake. The software delivered the fatal shock. The iPhone ran a scaled-down version of OS X, a robust desktop operating system. It featured a full, uncompromised web browser called Safari. Prior to this moment, Palm users accessed the internet through heavily compressed, text-heavy mobile protocols. Pages loaded slowly, and looked completely different from their desktop counterparts. The iPhone rendered the actual internet exactly as it appeared on a computer monitor. It transformed a specialized business tool into a limitless window to the digital world. The audience inside the Moscone Center erupted in sustained applause. Tech journalists rushed to publish their initial impressions, universally declaring the device a paradigm shift. Consumers, who had never cared about smartphones, suddenly realized they desperately wanted one. Inside the Palm headquarters in Sunnyvale, the reaction was drastically different. The leadership viewed the iPhone not as a lethal threat, but as a misguided novelty. They looked at the massive glass screen and saw a fragile toy. They looked at the software keyboard and concluded that serious business professionals would never accept typing on a flat, featureless surface without tactile feedback. Palm CEO Ed Colligan provided the most infamous summary of the company's internal blindness. Several weeks before the official iPhone launch, while rumors of an Apple phone reached a fever pitch, a journalist asked Colligan for his assessment. Colligan scoffed. He pointed out the immense difficulty of building cellular devices, navigating carrier certifications, and managing complex radio frequencies. He stated clearly that Palm had learned and struggled for years to figure out how to make a decent phone. He then delivered the quote that would permanently define his legacy. PC guys are not going to just figure this out. They are not going to just walk in. Colligan and his executive team suffered from a fatal dose of confirmation bias. They had spent years allowing wireless carriers like Sprint and Verizon to dictate their product designs. The carriers demanded specific buttons, exclusive software, and deep control over the user experience. Palm assumed Apple would have to submit to these same suffocating rules. They did not know that Steve Jobs had secretly negotiated a completely unprecedented deal with Singular Wireless, which later became AT&T. Apple retained absolute, total control over the iPhone hardware and software. They bypassed the carrier restrictions that had bogged down Palm's innovation for years. Furthermore, Palm fundamentally misunderstood the shifting nature of the consumer. Palm viewed their devices strictly as productivity tools meant for managing email, calendars, and spreadsheets. Apple viewed the iPhone as an entertainment hub, a mobile cinema, a camera, and a social connection device. Palm built machines for the office. Apple built a machine for the rest of a person's life. The iPhone officially went on sale in June 2007. Thousands of people camped on sidewalks outside Apple stores across the United States. The frenzy dominated national news broadcasts. The initial sales figures shattered industry records. Apple had successfully walked in and figured it out. In the immediate aftermath, Palm's daily operations did not collapse. They continued to sell Treo devices to corporate IT departments that remained deeply entrenched in the Palm ecosystem. Their quarterly revenue still looked respectable on paper. However, a silent, irreversible shift had occurred. The cultural momentum completely abandoned them. Palm was no longer the innovator. They were no longer the symbol of the future. They had instantly become a relic of a bygone era, defending a plastic keyboard against a tidal wave of glass. Engineers inside Palm who recognized the severe danger began to panic. They knew the aging Palm operating system could never replicate the fluid, hardware-accelerated animations of the iPhone. They knew their hardware designs looked outdated and chunky next to Apple's sleek aluminum and glass slab. The leadership finally realized their arrogant dismissal was a catastrophic mistake. The fortress was breached. Panic replaced complacency. The company desperately needed a lifeline, and they had exactly 0 modern products ready to fight back. The long, agonizing decline had officially begun. Chapter 4. The Slumber of Victory. The release of the iPhone in 2007 did not instantly bankrupt Palm. In fact, for a brief period, the company experienced a deceptive surge in sales. Palm introduced the Centro late that year. It was essentially a smaller, cheaper Treo, wrapped in brightly colored plastic. It targeted teenagers and young professionals who could not afford Apple's expensive device. The Treo sold millions of units. It provided a massive influx of cash. However, this success masked a terminal illness. The Treo was a localized painkiller applied to a severe structural fracture. It relied on the exact same aging hardware philosophy and the exact same crumbling software foundation. Palm executives looked at the Treo sales charts and convinced themselves they had successfully weathered the Apple storm. They went back to sleep. While Apple refined its capacitive glass touchscreens, Palm continued churning out thick plastic bricks. The market rapidly shifted its preference. Consumers now viewed physical keyboards not as productivity tools, but as wasted space. They wanted large screens to watch videos, browse the full internet, and view photographs. Palm devices featured small, low-resolution displays trapped above cramped plastic buttons. Using a Palm device in 2008 felt like operating machinery from a different decade. The stylus, once the symbol of digital sophistication, now appeared ridiculous. Users grew frustrated, prodding at tiny resistive screens while their friends smoothly pinched and zoomed on iPhones. Palm's hardware design team remained paralyzed by their past success. They refused to abandon the Treo form factor. They believed the physical keyboard was their ultimate defensive wall. In reality, it was an anchor pulling them under. The hardware stagnation was severe, but the software decay was fatal. The operating system running inside these devices, Palm OS Garnet, was a digital fossil. They fall. It possessed DNA dating back to the original 1996 organizers. It fundamentally lacked modern capabilities. It could not handle true multitasking. If a user downloaded a large file, the entire device locked up until the process finished. The interface looked rudimentary and pixelated. Third-party developers, the lifeblood of any modern mobile platform, abandoned Palm. They shifted their resources to Apple, lured by the promise of the upcoming App Store. Developing for Palm OS meant fighting against ancient code limits and memory leaks. The ecosystem withered. A smartphone without modern applications quickly transforms back into a simple cellular phone. Palm essentially offered consumers a pager in an era of pocket computers. Apple attacked Palm from the top of the market. Then, an unexpected enemy attacked from the bottom. Google entered the mobile war. They did not build a phone. They built an operating system called Android and offered it to hardware manufacturers for free. This move fundamentally altered the global battlefield. Giant electronics companies like HTC, Samsung, and Motorola suddenly gained access to a modern, touch-friendly operating system. They no longer needed to spend billions developing their own software. They focused entirely on building sleek glass hardware to compete with the iPhone. Palm found itself trapped in a lethal vice. Apple owned the premium sector. A massive army of Android manufacturers rapidly flooded the rest of the market. Both competitors offered true modern web browsing and robust application stores. Palm offered an updated organizer. The market reality finally shattered the illusion inside Palm headquarters. By late 2008, the situation turned critical. Smartphone buyers actively ignored Palm products. Carrier store shelves sat full of unsold Treo and Treo devices. Telecommunications companies, once Palm's closest allies, began canceling orders and dedicating their marketing budgets to iPhone and Android releases. The financial reports reflected this brutal rejection. Revenue plummeted. The company began burning through its cash reserves at a terrifying rate. They reported massive quarterly losses. Wall Street analysts downgraded the stock repeatedly. The share price collapsed from its historic highs to single digits. Investors panicked and fled. The company lost billions of dollars in market valuation in a matter of months. Inside the Sunnyvale offices, arrogance dissolved into sheer terror. The executive team watched their market share evaporate daily. The strategies that had guaranteed billions in revenue just a few years prior now produced nothing but failure. Employee morale disintegrated. Top engineers and designers recognized the sinking ship and resigned, accepting lucrative offers from Apple and Google. The remaining staff faced impossible deadlines and shrinking budgets. They were tasked with fixing a fundamentally broken product lineup while the entire industry sprinted past them. The board of directors realized that minor course corrections were useless. The current leadership had driven the company directly into a brick wall. Palm required a complete demolition and reconstruction of its entire technology stack. The clock was rapidly running out. Palm did not have the cash required to survive a multi-year rebuilding process. They desperately needed an outside lifeline. In a final effort to stave off total bankruptcy, Palm turned to private equity. Elevation Partners, an investment firm, injected hundreds of millions of dollars into the dying company. This cash arrived with strict conditions. Elevation demanded radical changes in leadership. They needed an executive who understood modern consumer electronics, hardware supply chains, and high-level software engineering. They found their savior in a man named John Rubinstein. John Rubinstein was not a typical corporate manager. He was a Silicon Valley legend. He previously served as the senior vice president of hardware engineering at Apple. He was the man responsible for creating the iPod, the device that saved Apple from its own near-death experience. Rubinstein understood exactly what it took to build consumer products that people actually desired. He walked into Palm and surveyed the wreckage. He immediately recognized that the current hardware and the ancient Palm OS were completely unsalvageable. He halted development on existing projects. He gave his engineers a brutal, terrifying directive. They had to throw everything away. They had to build a brand new, world-class operating system and a revolutionary piece of hardware from absolute scratch. And they had to do it before the Elevation Partners' cash ran out. The survival of the entire Palm empire now rested on a single, massive gamble. Chapter 5. The Last Gamble, named WebOS. The arrival of John Rubinstein in 2007 signaled a complete and violent reset for Palm. Elevation Partners did not inject hundreds of millions of dollars into a failing company just to watch them produce another minor update to the aging Treo line. They demanded a revolution. Rubinstein knew exactly what a revolution required. He had spent years at Apple building the intricate hardware supply chain that made the iPod a massive global phenomenon. He understood the ruthless discipline necessary to build a modern consumer electronics ecosystem. He walked into the Palm headquarters in Sunnyvale and immediately surveyed the existing projects. He found them all severely lacking in vision and execution. He swiftly canceled the development of a highly publicized companion device called the Folio, deeming it a massive distraction. He recognized that the decaying Palm OS was entirely useless against the aggressive rise of the iPhone and the emerging threat of the Android platform. He made the only logical decision available to a company facing imminent destruction. He ordered his engineering teams to burn the ships. They had to start over from absolute zero. The directive was brutal and terrifying for the staff. Palm had to build a brand new mobile operating system and a completely new flagship smartphone simultaneously. They had to execute this massive undertaking while their existing sales collapsed and their remaining cash reserves dwindled every single day. The project operated under a blanket of extreme secrecy inside their corporate campus. Rubinstein recruited top-tier talent from across Silicon Valley, including brilliant interface designers like Matias Duarte, another highly respected former Apple executive. The newly assembled team understood the sheer gravity of their mission. They were not just building a new phone to compete in a crowded market. They were fighting a desperate battle for the very survival of the company that originally invented the smartphone category. The software engineering team focused on a singular, core philosophy. They wanted to create an operating system that felt entirely fluid, intuitive, and deeply connected to the internet. They recognized that the iPhone, for all its undeniable brilliance, still operated like a static grid of isolated applications. If a user wanted to switch from an email draft to a web browser, they had to explicitly close one app, physically return to the home screen, and tap to open the other. The Palm team believed they could engineer a vastly superior workflow. They built WebOS. It was an engineering marvel, constructed on modern internet technologies like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This foundational choice made it incredibly easy for independent developers to build applications, removing the friction that plagued older software systems. However, the true genius of WebOS lay in its revolutionary user interface. Duarte and his design team invented the concept of interactive cards. When a user opened any application, it appeared as a virtual, floating card on the screen. If they opened a second app, another card appeared alongside it. Users could smoothly swipe left and right across the glass to switch between active applications without closing anything. It was true, elegant, visual multitasking. If a user wanted to close an app, they simply placed a finger on the card and flicked it upward, tossing it off the top of the display. The gesture felt entirely natural, tactile, and deeply satisfying. Apple and Google would not implement similar card-based multitasking interfaces until many years later. At the time, it was a profound and shocking leap forward in software design. The second major innovation of WebOS was an underlying feature called synergy. In 2008, managing digital contacts across various platforms was a chaotic nightmare for consumers. Users had phone numbers locked on SIM cards, email addresses trapped in corporate Microsoft Exchange servers, and social media connections scattered across Facebook. Synergy solved this problem completely in the background. It automatically pulled raw data from every single digital account a user possessed and seamlessly merged it into one unified, intelligent contact list. If a friend had a phone number stored in Google and a high-resolution profile picture on Facebook, Synergy instantly combined them into a single, beautiful contact card. It treated cloud computing not just as a remote storage locker, but as a dynamic, intelligent engine that actively organized a user's digital life. While the software team perfected the code of WebOS, the hardware team raced to finish the physical device that would carry it into battle. They named it the Palm Pre. The industrial design team aimed for an organic, natural shape that felt entirely different from the cold, industrial slabs produced by their competitors. They crafted a device that looked and felt like a smooth, water-polished riverstone. It featured a bright, curved, multi-touch screen that sloped gently at the edges. However, the leadership refused to completely abandon their historical identity. They firmly believed that physical keyboards still held immense value for fast, accurate typing. They engineered a complex sliding mechanism. The entire glass screen pushed upward with a satisfying click to reveal a compact, tactile, QWERTY keyboard hidden underneath. It was a dense, highly complex piece of physical engineering packed into a tiny footprint. The final product was ready for public viewing by the end of 2008. Palm prepared to reveal their ultimate gamble to the world. They chose the massive Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas in January 2009 as their battleground. The technology press arrived at the Palm press conference with extremely low expectations. Most industry analysts considered the company essentially dead. They expected to see another desperate, uninspired attempt to update the tired Treo line with a larger screen or a new color. John Rubinstein stepped onto the brightly lit stage. He did not waste time with lengthy corporate speeches or financial projections. He immediately introduced the Palm Pre and demonstrated WebOS live. As the presentation unfolded, the mood in the massive auditorium shifted from deep skepticism to absolute shock. When the presenter demonstrated the smooth, card-based multitasking, The crowd audibly gasped. When they casually flicked an application off the screen to close it, the room erupted in genuine, spontaneous cheers. When Synergy seamlessly combined complex contact data in real time, seasoned technology journalists shook their heads in pure disbelief. Palm had actually done it. They had built a software experience that did not just match the fluid magic of the iPhone, but in many distinct ways, completely surpassed it. The immediate market reaction was electric. Major technology blogs published glowing, breathless reviews, declaring the Palm Pre the most exciting device of the entire year. The company's stock price, which had been languishing near zero, exploded upward overnight. Investors poured fresh money back into the company. The public narrative shifted instantly. Palm was no longer a dying corporate relic. They were the brilliant underdog, staging the greatest, most dramatic comeback in the history of Silicon Valley. They had successfully leaped over the massive technological chasm that threatened to swallow them whole. The atmosphere inside the Palm headquarters transformed into pure jubilation. Engineers who had worked 100-hour weeks for over a year finally exhaled. They had delivered an undisputed masterpiece of modern software engineering. They had provided the company with the exact weapon it desperately needed to reclaim its crown. The press immediately hailed the Palm Pre as the definitive iPhone killer. The highly anticipated public launch was scheduled for June 2009. Everything seemed perfectly aligned for a massive, historic financial victory. But a brilliant software demonstration is only the first step in a very long, brutal war. The true test of a consumer product is not how it performs perfectly on a controlled stage, but how it survives on a chaotic factory assembly line and in the hands of millions of ordinary users. The company had bet its entire existence on this single, complex device. They were about to discover that engineering a miracle in a laboratory is vastly different from manufacturing one at a global scale. Chapter 6. Cracks in the Hardware. The 6th of June, 2009. The Palm Pre officially launched in the United States. Lines formed outside Sprint retail stores. Technology enthusiasts arrived early. They were eager to hold the device that promised to rival Apple. For a brief moment, the massive gamble appeared successful. Opening weekend sales broke Sprint company records. Palm executives breathed a collective sigh of relief. The stock price held strong. The media narrative celebrated the return of an industry pioneer. Then the honeymoon ended abruptly. A mobile phone is a physical object. It lives in pockets. It gets dropped. It is touched hundreds of times a day. The software inside can be brilliant, but if the physical shell fails, the entire user experience collapses. The Palm Pre failed the physical test completely. The problems began with the core design philosophy. Palm wanted the device to look and feel like a smooth river stone. To achieve this shape and keep production costs down, the manufacturing team utilized cheap, glossy plastic. The material felt terrible. It collected fingerprints instantly. It felt slippery and insecure in the hand. More importantly, it was incredibly fragile. Within weeks of the launch, users reported hairline cracks appearing around the screen display and the charging port. The plastic shell simply could not withstand normal daily use. The defining feature of the hardware became its greatest liability. Palm refused to abandon the physical keyboard. They engineered a sliding mechanism to hide the keys behind the screen. A high-quality slider requires precise engineering and premium metal materials. Palm used cheap plastic tracks. The two halves of the phone did not fit tightly together. When the device was closed, the top half wobbled against the bottom half. Users nicknamed this severe flaw the Oreo effect. It made a supposedly premium smartphone feel like a cheap disposable toy. When users pushed the screen upward, the situation worsened. The physical keyboard was a disaster. This was the exact feature Palm defended so fiercely. The keys were tiny. They were made of hard, rigid plastic with sharp edges. They offered terrible tactile feedback. Typing a long email on the Palm Pre was an exercise in frustration and physical pain. The company that literally invented mobile data entry had forgotten how to build a usable keyboard. The internal components also struggled to keep pace. The Palm Pre featured a processor that was barely powerful enough to run the ambitious WebOS software. The beautiful, card-based multitasking demanded heavy computing resources. When users opened too many applications, the system slowed down dramatically. The smooth animations stuttered. The battery life proved catastrophic. The small internal battery could not sustain the continuous cloud synchronization of the Synergy feature and the heavy graphics processing. Users discovered their phones dying by early afternoon. A mobile device loses all value if it must remain tethered to a wall charger. Palm rushed to sell an inductive charging dock called the Touchstone. It was a brilliant piece of technology. It allowed wireless charging years before it became an industry standard. However, forcing customers to buy an expensive accessory just to keep their phone alive during a standard workday generated massive consumer resentment. Beyond the physical defects, Palm crippled the Pre with a fatal business decision. They signed an exclusive distribution agreement with Sprint. In 2009, AT&T held the exclusive rights to the iPhone. Verizon dominated the rest of the premium market with a massive, highly reliable network. Sprint sat a distant third. They struggled with network reliability and severe customer service issues. Palm desperately needed a massive launch. They needed millions of users to adopt WebOS immediately to attract software developers. By locking the Pre exclusively to Sprint, they instantly alienated the vast majority of the American consumer base. People watched the brilliant WebOS demonstrations on television. They checked their current carrier contracts. They decided the Palm Pre was not worth the financial hassle of switching to an inferior cellular network. The initial wave of enthusiasm hit a solid brick wall. The early adopters who bought the phone on launch day began experiencing the hardware failures. Word spread rapidly across technology forums and social media. The narrative shifted violently. Reviewers updated their scores. They warned buyers away. The brilliant software could not save the terrible hardware. Return rates skyrocketed to alarming levels. Customers walked back into Sprint stores and handed the devices over the retail counter. They complained about the wobbly hinge, the cracked plastic, and the dead batteries. Sprint panicked. They found their warehouses filling up with defective and unwanted Palm inventory. They quietly reduced their marketing support for the device. They stopped pushing it to new customers walking through their doors. The financial reality hit the Sunnyvale headquarters like a physical blow. The hundreds of millions of dollars injected by Elevation partners were almost entirely gone. The massive gamble had produced a software miracle wrapped inside a manufacturing nightmare. Revenue stalled completely. The stock price plummeted back toward the single digits. John Rubinstein and the executive team scrambled to fix the crisis. They rushed an updated model called the Palm Pre Plus to market. They improved the build quality slightly. They eventually broke the Sprint exclusivity agreement, bringing the device to Verizon and AT&T. They released a cheaper, candy bar-style phone called the Palm Pixie to target younger buyers. It was too little and far too late. The momentum was completely broken. The consumer electronics market is completely ruthless. A company rarely gets a second chance to make a first impression. Palm had captured the world's attention for a brief, shining moment. They fumbled it entirely on the factory assembly line. Software developers looked at the anemic sales figures and walked away. They refused to invest time building applications for a platform that nobody was buying. Without applications, WebOS became a digital ghost town. The Apple App Store was exploding with hundreds of thousands of programs. Google Android was capturing the rest of the global hardware market. Palm was left standing alone. They held a brilliant operating system trapped inside a broken plastic shell. The company was bleeding cash rapidly. They had played their final card. They had exhausted their engineering resources. They had burned through their venture capital. They had lost their market goodwill. Mark. The independent survival of Palm computing was no longer mathematically possible. The pioneers of the mobile age had to hang a for sale sign on the front door. They needed a massive corporate giant to rescue them, or they would completely cease to exist. Chapter 7. Selling to the Giant. By early 2010, the financial reality inside Palm headquarters became mathematically impossible to ignore. The Palm Pre, despite its brilliant software, had failed to capture the consumer market due to fatal hardware defects. The subsequent models, the Pre Plus and the Pixie, failed to reverse the downward trajectory. The massive cash injection from Elevation Partners was entirely depleted. The company burned through its remaining capital, just keeping the lights on. John Rubinstein and the board of directors faced a stark, undeniable choice. They could declare bankruptcy and watch the company dissolve, or they could find a massive corporate buyer willing to absorb them. They put a for sale sign on the lawn of the company that invented the smartphone. Several technology giants expressed mild interest, but one company saw a unique strategic opportunity. Hewlett-Packard, universally known as HP, was the largest personal computer manufacturer in the world. However, HP possessed a glaring weakness. They completely missed the mobile revolution. They watched Apple build a closed, highly profitable ecosystem with the iPhone and the newly announced iPad. HP realized that relying on Microsoft Windows for their future devices left them incredibly vulnerable. They wanted their own proprietary software platform. They did not just want to buy a struggling phone manufacturer. They wanted WebOS. In April 2010, HP announced the acquisition of Palm for $1.2 billion. On paper, the marriage appeared perfect. Palm desperately needed deep financial pockets, global supply chain leverage, and massive marketing budgets. HP possessed all three in abundance. HP needed a modern, elegant operating system to power their future hardware ambitions. Palm held the exact keys to that future. The executives at HP painted a grand, sweeping vision. They promised to install WebOS on every single device they manufactured. They envisioned a completely unified digital ecosystem where smartphones, tablet computers, desktop PCs, and even office printers communicated flawlessly through the WebOS interface. For a brief moment, the exhausted engineers at Palm felt a surge of genuine hope. They finally had the resources to finish what they started. The optimism did not survive the collision of corporate cultures. Palm was fundamentally a Silicon Valley startup. They operated with a sense of desperate urgency. Their engineering teams were accustomed to rapid iteration, informal communication, and agile decision-making. HP was a massive, legacy industrial conglomerate. They operated through endless committees, rigid bureaucratic hierarchies, and paralyzing risk aversion. When the two cultures merged, the friction was immediate and toxic. HP management immediately demanded a new flagship product to combat the sudden, explosive rise of the Apple iPad. They ordered the former Palm engineers to design and build a WebOS tablet computer. They called it the HP TouchPad. The directive was clear, but the execution process was agonizing. The Palm team found themselves trapped in a labyrinth of HP management review boards. Simple engineering decisions that previously took hours now required weeks of formal presentations and executive approvals. The agility that allowed Palm to invent WebOS in a single year was completely crushed under the weight of the HP corporate machine. Furthermore, HP forced the hardware team to utilize specific, favored component suppliers rather than sourcing the absolute best parts available. The development timeline was aggressively compressed. The engineers worked grueling, unsustainable hours. desperately trying to optimize the complex WebOS software for a tablet display while fighting their own parent company over internal hardware specifications. In July 2011, the HP touchpad officially hit the retail market. It was a spectacular disappointment. The physical hardware felt heavy, thick, and undeniably cheap compared to the sleek aluminum iPad. The processor struggled violently to run the operating system. The beautiful, fluid card-based multitasking that defined WebOS on the smartphone became sluggish and unresponsive on the larger tablet screen. Applications crashed frequently. The core software simply was not finished. It was pushed out the factory door entirely to meet an arbitrary corporate deadline. The technology press reviewed the device and delivered a unified, brutal verdict. They advised consumers to avoid the touchpad entirely. Buyers listened. Retail shelves remained completely full. Massive electronics chains like Best Buy accumulated massive inventories of unsold touchpads. They eventually issued an ultimatum to HP, demanding the company take the defective products back and issue full refunds. The flagship device of the new HP and Palm marriage was a catastrophic retail failure. The ultimate betrayal arrived just weeks later. HP was undergoing its own internal civil war. The board of directors had recently appointed a new chief executive officer named Leo Apotheker. Apotheker built his career in high-level enterprise software. He harbored a deep disdain for the low-margin, highly volatile consumer electronics market. He wanted to transform HP into a pure software and services company, mimicking the highly profitable model of IBM. He looked at the disastrous launch of the touchpad and the massive financial losses incurred by the hardware division. He made a swift, ruthless, and entirely cold calculation. On the 18th of August, 2011, exactly 49 days after the touchpad went on sale, Apotheker held a standard quarterly earnings call with Wall Street investors. Without any prior warning to his own engineering staff, he dropped a bomb that stunned the entire global technology sector. HP announced they were immediately shutting down all operations related to WebOS devices. They officially killed the touchpad. They canceled all upcoming WebOS smartphones. They completely abandoned the platform they had spent $1.2 billion to acquire just 16 months earlier. The remaining Palm employees heard the news the exact same way the public did. They sat in their offices, entirely paralyzed by the sudden execution order. They had survived the stagnation of the Treo. They had survived the devastating launch of the iPhone. They had built a software miracle under impossible pressure. They had endured the crushing bureaucracy of a massive corporate merger, only to be casually eliminated by a spreadsheet calculation from a CEO who did not understand their product and did not care about their legacy. In a final, bitter twist of irony, HP decided to liquidate the remaining touchpad inventory by dropping the retail price to a mere $99. At that massive discount, the device became an instant global sensation. Consumers crashed retail websites and fought in physical stores to buy them. It proved that people actually loved the WebOS interface and the interactive cards, provided the price matched the flawed hardware. But the fire sale was merely a funeral pyre. The decision was final. The company that pioneered the personal digital assistant, the company that placed the internet in the pockets of millions, was officially, irreversibly dead. Chapter 8. The Legacy of a Great Failure. The sudden execution of WebOS by Hewlett-Packard in August 2011 marked the official end of Palm computing. It was a brutal, undignified death for a company that had essentially invented the personal digital assistant. Business schools, financial analysts, and technology historians immediately began performing the corporate autopsy. They desperately needed to understand the mechanics of this collapse. They wanted to know how an empire that completely dominated the American mobile market in 2005 could evaporate entirely just 6 years later. The answers revealed a classic, devastating case of the innovator's dilemma. Palm suffered from a lethal combination of corporate hubris and an absolute inability to abandon their most successful product. For years, the Palm Treo generated massive, reliable profits. This sustained financial success blinded the executive leadership. They looked at their loyal corporate customers and assumed the physical keyboard was an immutable law of mobile productivity. When Apple introduced the iPhone in 2007, Palm executives dismissed the massive glass screen as a fragile gimmick. They failed to recognize that consumer desires had fundamentally shifted overnight. People no longer wanted a digital organizer that could make simple phone calls. They wanted a pocket-sized, fully functional computer connected permanently to the internet. Palm reacted far too slowly to this shifting paradigm. By the time they recognized the existential threat, Apple and Google had already divided the highly lucrative global market between them. When Palm finally decided to fight back, they engineered a genuine software masterpiece. And John Rubinstein and his team built WebOS, a platform that was arguably years ahead of both iOS and Android in terms of user experience. However, a brilliant operating system cannot survive inside a defective physical shell. Palm crippled their final gamble through disastrous manufacturing choices. They wrapped their futuristic software in cheap, glossy plastic. They compromised the structural integrity of the Palm Pre by clinging stubbornly to a sliding physical keyboard. Customers experienced cracked screens, wobbly hinges, and terrible battery life. The physical hardware completely betrayed the brilliant software. Furthermore, Palm compounded their manufacturing errors with fatal strategic blunders. In a desperate bid for initial launch funding and marketing support, they locked the Palm Pre into an exclusive distribution agreement with Sprint. At the time, Sprint was the third largest carrier in the United States. The network was plagued by a reputation for unreliable cellular coverage and poor customer service. Palm essentially built a cutting-edge life raft and threw it into a dry swimming pool. The vast majority of American consumers simply refused to switch carriers just to try a new operating system, no matter how elegant the multitasking looked on television commercials. However, the death of the Palm Corporation did not mean the death of its ideas. The technology they engineered was simply too good to disappear completely. Following the disastrous touchpad liquidation, Hewlett-Packard realized they possessed a massive, useless software asset. They eventually decided to open source parts of the WebOS code. In 2013, the South Korean electronics giant LG purchased the WebOS source code and its remaining patents. LG did not want to build smartphones to compete with Apple or Samsung. They wanted an elegant, fluid interface for their new line of smart televisions. Today, millions of living rooms around the world feature premium televisions powered by the direct descendant of the Palm Pre operating system. The brilliant card-based interface found a permanent, quiet home on the largest screens in the house. The human legacy of Palm proved even more influential than the code itself. When the company collapsed, its incredibly talented roster of designers and software engineers scattered across Silicon Valley. They carried the core philosophies of WebOS directly into the headquarters of their former rivals. Matias Duarte, the brilliant design director behind the WebOS card interface, accepted a major executive position at Google. He led the massive visual redesign of the Android operating system, introducing the clean, tactile aesthetic known as material design. Other key Palm software engineers migrated to Apple in Cupertino. Within a few years, both iOS and Android adopted the exact same multitasking gestures and visual cues that Palm invented in 2009. The conceptual victory is undeniable. Whenever a modern smartphone user swipes up from the bottom of their glass screen to close an active application, they are executing a gesture explicitly engineered by Palm. Whenever a user smoothly scrolls through a horizontal list of open applications, they are navigating an interface conceived in the desperate, final days of the Sunnyvale campus. Whenever a phone seamlessly merges a cloud-based email contact list with a social media profile, it is utilizing the exact synergy concept that Palm introduced to the world. Palm completely lost the corporate war, but they unequivocally won the design argument. They laid the invisible, foundational blueprint for the entire modern mobile experience. The physical remnants of the empire are completely gone. The original Palm headquarters buildings now house different startup companies. The physical keyboards they championed are entirely obsolete. The plastic styluses belong in technology museums next to heavy cathode ray tube monitors and floppy disks. But the story of Palm remains a vital, enduring lesson in the brutal physics of the technology industry. It proves that past success guarantees absolutely nothing about the future. It demonstrates that pioneering a new market does not grant a permanent right to rule it. And it shows that a company can invent the exact future of human communication and still completely fail to survive long enough to witness it. Palm Computing lived fast, dominated completely, and died tragically. Yet, their ghost currently resides in the pocket of almost every single human being on Earth.